Have you ever wondered how an empire that ruled for 1,000 years, one that gave us roads, aqueducts, and laws, could just disappear? The story of the fall of Rome isn't about a single event, but a slow, complex unraveling that holds powerful lessons for us even today. Let's dive into the epic saga of how the mighty Roman Empire met its end. For centuries, Rome was the center of the known world. Its legions were unstoppable, its engineering was legendary, and its influence stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia. To be a Roman citizen was to be part of the greatest civilization on earth. But beneath the surface of this colossal power, cracks were beginning to form, slowly but surely undermining its very foundations. It started right at the top with a crisis of leadership. The 3rd century AD was a period of chaos. Rome saw a dizzying parade of emperors, many of whom were generals who seized power only to be assassinated by their rivals. This constant turmoil, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, bred deep-seated corruption and instability. With leaders focused on their own survival rather than the good of the state, long-term planning became impossible. The empire was like a giant ship without a captain, drifting aimlessly into a storm. This political rot made Rome vulnerable, unable to effectively respond to the growing threats both inside and outside its borders. While the politicians squabbled, the Roman economy was in a freefall. To pay for its massive army and the lavish lifestyles of the elite, emperors began to devalue their currency. They minted coins with less and less precious metal, a process that led to runaway inflation. Imagine your money being worth less and less each day. Prices for everyday goods like bread and oil skyrocketed. Trade broke down, and the vast network that had made the empire so prosperous began to crumble. Heavy taxes were imposed on farmers and merchants, crushing the middle class and forcing many to abandon their land. The economic engine of the empire was sputtering out. As Rome weakened from within, its enemies grew bolder on the outside. For centuries, the Romans had considered the various tribes living beyond their borders as barbarians. But these groups, like the Goths, Vandals, and Franks, were becoming more organized and powerful. Driven by climate change, internal conflicts, and the terrifying advance of the Huns from the east, these tribes began to press against Rome's frontiers. At first, Rome tried to absorb them, using them as soldiers in its own armies. But this policy backfired. These barbarian soldiers often had little loyalty to Rome and would turn on their former masters. The final act was a series of devastating invasions. In 410 AD, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, did the unthinkable. They sacked the city of Rome itself. The psychological shock was immense. The Eternal City, which hadn't been breached by a foreign enemy in 800 years, had fallen. This was followed by more invasions. The Vandals sacked Rome again in 455, and the Huns, under the fearsome Attila, carved a path of destruction across Europe. The Western Roman Empire, hollowed out by political corruption, economic collapse, and constant warfare, was stretched to its breaking point. The end came not with a bang, but with a whimper. In 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. Odoacer didn't even bother to claim the title of emperor. He simply sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople, the capital of the still thriving Eastern Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire was no more. Its fall marked the end of the ancient world and the beginning of the Middle Ages. So the fall of Rome wasn't a single event. It was a perfect storm of internal decay and external pressure. It teaches us that even the mightiest of powers can crumble when its leadership fails, its economy breaks, and it can no longer defend its borders. Have you ever wondered how an empire as mighty as Rome could just crumble? For centuries, Rome was the center of the world, a beacon of power and civilization. But by the 5th century AD, the unthinkable was happening. The Eternal City, once thought to be invincible, was brought to its knees, not by a rival empire, but by so-called barbarian tribes from beyond its borders. Who were these people, and how did they manage to topple a superpower? Let's dive into the dramatic final act of the Western Roman Empire. First, let's meet the main players. We often hear the term barbarian, but it wasn't just one group. The Romans used it to describe anyone outside their empire. The most famous were the Goths, who later split into the Visigoths and Ostrogoths. Then there were the Vandals, a Germanic people whose name has become synonymous with destruction. And of course the Huns, nomadic warriors from the east, whose fearsome reputation preceded them wherever they went. These weren't just mindless savages. They were complex societies with their own cultures, leaders, and motivations, often pushed into Roman territory by conflict, climate change, and the desire for a better life. For centuries, Rome had managed these groups through a mix of warfare, diplomacy, and assimilation. Some were hired as mercenaries, others were settled on borderlands, but the system was fragile. In 410 AD, the world was left in absolute shock. The Visigoths, led by their king, Alaric, marched on Rome itself. For the first time in 800 years, a foreign enemy entered the city. They didn't burn it to the ground, but they did sack it, plundering its immense wealth for 3 days. The psychological impact was devastating. If Rome itself could be violated, was anything safe? The message was clear. The empire's defenses were failing. Just a few decades later, an even greater threat emerged from the east. His name was Attila, the leader of the Huns. Known as the Scourge of God, Attila forged a terrifying empire that stretched across Central and Eastern Europe. He wasn't interested in settling down. He was a master of extortion, demanding massive tributes of gold from the Romans to spare their cities. He swept through the Balkans and Gaul, leaving a trail of destruction. While he was famously persuaded not to sack Rome itself in 452, his campaigns bled the empire dry and terrorized its people. Attila's reign of terror showed that Rome's military, once the most formidable fighting force on earth, could no longer effectively protect its vast frontiers. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its economy was shattered, its territories were lost, and its armies were mostly composed of barbarian mercenaries who had little loyalty to Rome. The Vandals had conquered North Africa, Rome's breadbasket, and even sacked the city themselves in 455. The final blow came quietly, not with a great battle, but with a whimper. In 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer didn't even bother to name a successor. He simply sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, signaling that the Western Empire was no more. The fall of Rome wasn't a single event, but a long, complex process. It was a story of internal decay, economic crisis, and relentless external pressure. The Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns weren't just destroyers. They were catalysts for change, peoples who exposed the fatal weaknesses of a sprawling empire and, in the process, laid the foundations for the new kingdoms of medieval Europe. The world would never be the same again. Have you ever wondered how an empire that ruled the world for 1,000 years could just fall apart? The Roman Empire wasn't just conquered by armies. It was eaten from the inside out by a catastrophic economic collapse. Let's dive into how it happened. Imagine a government spending money it doesn't have. Sounds familiar, right? Rome's government was a black hole for cash. Endless wars, massive building projects like the Colosseum, and a huge government payroll meant they were constantly broke. To pay for it all, they cranked up taxes to crushing levels. Farmers and small business owners were taxed so heavily they couldn't afford to run their businesses anymore. Many simply abandoned their land, leading to food shortages and even less tax revenue. It was a vicious cycle. At the same time, Rome had a serious innovation problem. Why invent a new machine to do a job when you could just use a slave? The Roman economy was built on the backs of millions of slaves. While this made a few people very rich, it completely stalled technological progress. They weren't developing more efficient ways to farm, build, or create goods. When the empire stopped expanding and the supply of new slaves dried up, this reliance on manual labor became a massive weakness. They couldn't produce enough to keep the economy going. Now, let's talk about money. If you held a Roman coin, a denarius, in the early empire, it was almost pure silver. But as emperors got more desperate for cash, they started debasing the currency. They would melt down the coins, mix in cheaper metals like copper, and mint more coins that looked the same but were worth far less. People weren't stupid. They knew their money was becoming junk. This caused rampant inflation. Prices for everyday goods like bread and oil skyrocketed. A soldier's salary, which once supported a family, could barely buy a loaf of bread. Savings became worthless, and trust in the economy evaporated. With the money worthless and the empire in turmoil, things got dangerous. The famous Roman roads and sea lanes, once protected by powerful legions, became infested with bandits and pirates. It was no longer safe to transport goods. The intricate trade network that brought grain from Egypt, olive oil from Spain, and spices from the east completely fell apart. Regions had to fend for themselves, and the interconnected economy that was the bedrock of Roman power crumbled into isolated local economies. This was like the ancient world's version of the internet shutting down. Finally, a broke empire can't afford a strong army. Roman soldiers, once the most feared fighting force in the world, were now paid in worthless coins if they were paid at all. To fill the ranks, Rome began hiring foreign mercenaries soldiers who fought for money, not for loyalty to Rome. When the paycheck stopped, their loyalty vanished. These weakened, unreliable armies couldn't defend the vast borders from invading tribes. The economic rot had hollowed out Rome's military might, leaving it vulnerable. So the fall of Rome wasn't a single event. It was a slow, painful decay caused by crippling government spending, a lack of innovation, hyperinflation, and the collapse of trade. September 4th, 476 AD, to most people in the sprawling city of Rome, it was just another day. The markets were bustling, senators were politicking, and life went on. But in the halls of power, something seismic was happening. An event that would echo through eternity, marking the symbolic end of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Today, we're journeying back to that fateful day, the day the Western Roman Empire fell. Imagine the scene. A teenage emperor, ironically named Romulus Augustulus, after both the founder of Rome and its first emperor. He wasn't a mighty conqueror or a brilliant statesman. He was a boy, a puppet placed on the throne by his powerful father. For less than a year, he held a title that had once commanded the known world. But the empire he presided over was a shadow of its former self. Its borders were collapsing, its economy was in shambles, and its armies were mostly made up of non-Roman mercenaries. Enter Odoacer, a formidable Germanic chieftain, a leader of the very mercenaries hired to protect Rome. But he and his men were tired of empty promises. They wanted land, a permanent home within the empire they had sworn to defend. When their demands were refused, Odoacer didn't hesitate. He marched on Ravenna, the capital of the Western Empire at the time, and faced little resistance. There was no epic battle, no last stand at the city gates. It was more of a political negotiation, but one held at the point of a sword. The young Romulus Augustulus was forced to abdicate. He handed over the imperial insignia, the diadem, the purple toga, and effectively signed the warrant of a 1,200-year-old legacy in the West. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to such a monumental power. Odoacer didn't declare himself emperor. Instead, he declared himself king of Italy and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, with a message. The West no longer needed its own emperor. But here's a crucial point that often gets overlooked. Rome didn't just vanish overnight. The fall in 476 AD was really the end of the Western Roman Empire. In the East, the empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, would continue to thrive for another 1,000 years. It preserved Roman law, culture, and knowledge, acting as a beacon of civilization throughout the Middle Ages. So, while one half of the Roman world was entering a new, uncertain era, often called the Dark Ages, the other half was still going strong. So, why do we fixate on 476 AD? Because it's a powerful symbol. It represents the end of an era, the collapse of a central authority that had defined Europe for centuries. The abdication of Romulus Augustulus wasn't the cause of the fall, but its final symptom. The real causes were a complex mix of economic decay, political instability, overextension, and constant external pressure, a process that had been unfolding for decades, even centuries. The fall of Rome wasn't just a historical event. It was a profound shift in the world's order. The vacuum of power it left behind gave rise to new kingdoms, new languages, and a new social structure that would evolve into modern Europe. The idea of Rome, its laws, its engineering, and its language, Latin, would continue to influence civilization forever. From the ashes of the Western Empire, a new world was born. The story of 476 AD isn't just about an empire's death. The fall of Rome, it feels like an inevitable event, a fixed point in history. But what if it wasn't? What if a few key decisions had gone differently? Could the Roman Empire have survived the chaos of the 5th century? Let's explore this fascinating what if. Imagine for a moment that the sweeping reforms attempted by emperors like Diocletian and Constantine actually stuck. Diocletian tried to solve the empire's crippling succession crises by creating the Tetrarchy, a system of 4 rulers. It was a brilliant idea on paper, but it crumbled under the weight of personal ambition. What if it had worked? A stable, predictable transfer of power could have prevented decades of destructive civil wars that drained the empire's treasury and manpower. Instead of generals marching on Rome, they'd be defending the frontiers. A stable government means a stable economy, allowing Rome to afford its legions and infrastructure without crushing its citizens with taxes. Now let's talk about leadership and size. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire was a logistical nightmare, too vast to govern effectively from a single capital. A smarter, more pragmatic emperor might have realized that some territories were more trouble than they were worth. Imagine a strategic retreat, a planned consolidation. Perhaps they pull back from Britain, abandon the costly German frontiers, and create a smaller, more defensible, and wealthier core empire centered around the Mediterranean. A fortress Rome, if you will. This leaner empire would be easier to manage, its resources less stretched, and its borders more secure. It wouldn't be the sprawling empire of Trajan, but it would be alive. And what about the so-called barbarians? History paints them as a relentless tide of invaders. But the relationship was far more complex. Many Germanic tribes, like the Goths, didn't want to destroy Rome. They wanted to be part of it. They admired Roman culture and sought its security and prosperity. What if, instead of fighting them, a succession of wise emperors pursued a policy of alliance and integration? Imagine federated Gothic or Frankish states along the Rhine and Danube, serving as loyal buffer zones and providing elite soldiers for the Roman army in exchange for land and citizenship. This wasn't unheard of. Rome had done it before. A full-scale, consistent policy could have turned its greatest threat into its strongest ally, refreshing its military and population. With a stable West, what about the East? The wealthy, more urbanized Eastern Roman Empire, which we know as Byzantium, survived for another 1,000 years. But could the two halves have reunited? It's a long shot. By the 5th century, linguistic and cultural divides were deep. Greek was the language of the East, Latin the West. Their strategic interests were diverging. A permanent reunion was unlikely, but a strong collaborative alliance? Absolutely. Imagine a united Roman front, with the West's manpower and the East's wealth, working in concert. They could have jointly projected power, managed frontiers, and shared the burden of defense, creating a political and military bloc that would have been unmatched in the known world. So, what would a surviving Roman Empire mean for us today? The world would be unrecognizable. The Dark Ages might never have happened, or at least they would have been far less dark. Roman law, infrastructure, and a unified Latin-based language might have persisted across Western Europe. This could have delayed or even prevented the rise of the distinct national identities we see today: no France, no Spain, no England as we know them. Science and philosophy might have continued on their classical trajectory, potentially leading to an earlier Renaissance or even an industrial revolution. Christianity would still exist, but its relationship with a powerful Roman state would be vastly different. We would be living in a world shaped not by the fragmented legacy of Rome, but by its continuous, living presence. The very foundations of our modern world would be built on a different past. Of course, this is all speculation. But it shows that history isn't just a story of what happened, but a fascinating web of possibilities. What do you think? Could Rome have been saved? Let me know your theories in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into alternate history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.